Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Star Business Solutions 2019 webinar series. Today's webinar will be on Greentree approvals and alerts. Today we have Josh Diffie, our pre-sales engineer. He will be going through approvals and alerts and doing a demonstration for you. Today's agenda will basically go through notifications, populating workflow desktops, some simple approvals, then some complex approvals, and then questions and answers. I'd ask that as we go through the webinar that you type in any questions you might have, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. If you wait until the end, you might forget them, and what we'd like to do is encourage as many questions as possible, because the more questions we get, the more you learn and the more we can provide updates to you. Okay, I will now hand it over to Josh, who will do a demonstration and take over from now.
Thanks, Norman. Welcome, everyone. So yes, as Norman said, we'll be going through a couple of different types of approvals and alerts. Some of the people, some of the attendees will be existing approvals and alerts users. Some are interested in what the module can offer them. Some of you I know are interested in what else you can do with a module that you've already got. So let's dive on in and start with a couple of simple areas which you can use approvals and alerts for, and that is notifications. So notifications, there's three main types of notifications within Greentree. There is pop-up messages. There is what we call workflow notifications, which is what we're seeing in the bottom left-hand corner of this workflow desktop. And then there's emails. So I bring up my rule maintenance screen, which for those who have approvals and alerts, are obviously found under our workflow menu. Today we'll be going through not only some examples, but a very, very high level, pretty much in the clouds kind of level, bit of training to give you a bit of an idea of some of the things you can do with the approvals and alerts module without going into too much detail where we potentially lose or lose some of the audience. So let's bring up a bit of a, here's one I prepared earlier. So a very common rule that you might want that's purely for notification purposes. I've got here if the supplier's payment method or bank account details change. So a pretty basic rule in essence. There's not a huge amount to it, but very powerful in what it can provide for a combination of things, from auditing purposes through to just basic accountability. So with the rule maintenance screen, there's three main tabs, but we'll focus, there's two main tabs. There's the when to run, and then there's the what to do. Now you do have the ability within approvals and alerts to have different rules for different companies. For today's demonstration, I won't be logging in or out of different companies, but just keep that in mind. It doesn't have to be one set of rules for all of the companies that you may have. You can have different sets for different scenarios. So the when to run, we start by selecting what we're going to run it on. So of course, this one's the change of bank account details on a supplier. So of course, we're running this on the supplier record. There's the when. So this is another area where, depending on what the rule is, will really dictate what's appropriate here. So this concept of form driven, basically when I hit the save button or delete button on a screen, it can fire the approvals and alerts module, and that's that form driven tick box. And then there's what we call on new, on change, and on delete. So of course we're really focusing here on the change part. So of course that's what's ticked. I'll give you a couple of examples of the others as we progress through some of the other scenarios. The what to do. As I said, this one is actually a pretty basic rule. We've got a number of different conditions available to us on a record. Now, this list will grow or have more options or different options depending on what the record is. Once we get to some of the more approval-based rules, which we'll be talking about a little later, which is things like purchase orders and supplier invoices, you'll see that list is a lot bigger. What we're seeing here is a fairly common list of conditions that you have available to you, regardless of the record type. Now, we have this option we call when attribute changes value. You'll see that on in every list of conditions, and that's the one we're really focusing on at the moment. So some of this requires you to have a bit of an understanding of course, the database structure, not a huge amount, but at least a little bit, to be able to get an idea of course, what fields we're actually interested in checking out. So if I look here, I've got the payment method. So the idea behind this rule, if I just bring up the supplier maintenance screen for everyone, and just bring up my first supplier, this cash banking tab, I'm really interested if someone tries to change it from a payment method. So maybe they've gone from check to direct credit and they want to just put money in their own bank account details and we're trying to stop some fraud, or if they've changed the bank account information. So I've simply got it that when the attribute, which is a select option, when the payment method changes, now there's what we call an old and new value. If you are only interested in, say, suppliers that have had the payment method changed to direct credit, then in the new value, you can put the word direct credit, and it will say, doesn't matter what it changed from, if it changed to direct credit, we're interested. In this example, we're keeping it fairly simple. We don't care what it changed from or to, we just want to know if it changed. So we can leave both those fields blank. You'll notice that there's this and or radio option at the top. So I've said if the payment method changes or the bank account number changes, then we want to do something. Now, once again, you can make this as simple or as complex as you'd like it to be. I've just pretty much gone straight to the actions and I've sent a notification to the logged in user, so the person who's made the change, their manager and their supervisor. And I'll explain how those two fields are set up in just a moment. Depending on your process, you could have also made the supplier inactive temporarily until you've approved something. But as I said, we're trying to keep things fairly simple for the moment and just basically have some basic notifications. Now, as I said before, there are three main types of notifications. I've used the send a workflow notification message in both these examples below, but under our actions tab, there is the display a pop-up message. There is send an email. If you have an SMS gateway, you can also send SMSs via approvals and alerts. A little less common now that everyone has emails on their phones, but still an option available to you. And as I said before, the option of creating a workflow notification. So if you wanted to maybe tell the user that just hit the save button that their manager and supervisor has just been notified about something, that's an appropriate example of display a pop-up message. Hit the add button and say your manager and supervisor have been notified of this change. Now within here, you do have the option of dragging and dropping properties, which is probably a little less relevant for this pop-up message because of course I know which supplier it was because I've just hit the save button. But in the notifications, that's where I've got, for example, the supplier and then the supplier's name has had their bank details or payment method changed. Now, as I said before, I've got this sent to the logged in user's manager and supervisor, which for those who are unfamiliar with that option, under a user's setup, And let's just go to, I'm logged in as super because that makes life a lot easier from a demonstration perspective, and go to user preferences. We have a workflow button, and under there, you'll see approvals and BPM. You can select from the drop-down box a My Manager and a My Supervisor. So in this example, Amanda is my manager and Angela is my supervisor. So they'll be both notified when I make a change. So let's go in and very simply make a change. And I'll make some room here. And let's bring up Amanda's notification. So currently Amanda's got no unread notifications. When I hit that save, I get a pop-up message telling me my manager and supervisor have been notified of this change, and Amanda has got a notification saying supplier computer and parts maintenance bank details have changed. I can double click on that and see that it was from the super user. Now I could have put the modified timestamps, modified users, as much information as you'd like on these notifications. You can type a whole essay basically. It's just about, once again, deciding how much information is appropriate to provide to the person doing or being notified. So that is a fairly simple notification. As I said, we could have also sent an email as well. Now that example is really where the rule only created a notification. Now what you'll find is most rules, especially in the approvals side of this discussion, will also on the by also send notifications. So if you require something to be approved, usually they'll send a notification to someone. But in this scenario, it was purely just for notification purposes. Now you can schedule these rules to notify someone. So it could be every Monday morning, send me a list of all the records that have changed in the last week or something of that nature. Completely up to you to decide just how many types of notifications you'd like to be sent out of the system. If you do go down the path of creating lots of rules and lots of notifications, just keep in mind not to have death by email. You don't want to have so many rules that someone gets a huge number of emails that it all kind of just gets lost in the mix. Really make a conscious decision of what's appropriate for an email and what would make more sense to just have as a notification on a workflow desktop. Okay. Now, in previous webinars, we went through, I believe it was in the Back to Basics webinar, we went into a bit of workflow desktops, and it's a very common module and a very popular module. Now, workflow desktops allow you to show pretty much any record within Greentree on a workflow desk. So by coming into my my desktop designer, I have the ability of showing a large list. That's what my toolbox on the right hand side is all about, of records, so jobs, purchase orders, and so on. Now that list is not exhaustive or limitless, I should say. It doesn't have every single record type on it, but there is a bit of a catch-all bucket relatively close to the bottom called alert collections. You can use approvals and alerts to populate an alert collection with any record you would like. So that could be to give you a list of information that maybe the standard toolbox doesn't provide. So in the example I'm going to go through, excuse me, with my rules, I've set up an alert collection for assets. So there isn't in the workflow desktop designer, there isn't a toolbox option for assets. So I've gone in and created one. Now this is kind of a two-step process. One is you've got to first create the alert collection that you can populate, and then the second is to create the rule that populates it. So the alert collections are very simple. Once again, under our approvals and alerts, alert collections, you give it a name. So I've got one here called all assets, for example. And the main point here is this record type. So similar to the approvals alert screen, we have to select what the alert collection is of. In this example, it's CRM assets, but it could be anything you'd like. It could be inventory items, it could be suppliers, it could be GL accounts. As I said, any record type you would like, you can have in an alert collection. So this when to run, once again, comes into play. So I've got it here that it's a form driven. So on new or on change, we're checking if this matches our conditions. And if it does, we're going to populate our alert collection. Now, if this is a new rule and a new alert collection and you're an existing Greentree user and you've already got assets and whatnot, you may also be required to tick the scheduled option for that just first attempt at populating the alert collection. That scheduled option does have just a run now button, so you don't actually have to schedule it via the task queue or anything of that nature. You can just tick that box just to get the thing started and hit run now. The what to do tab, every rule must have a condition. So mine here is simply checking that it's not already in the alert collection called all assets. So that's a standard condition that you'll find on every single record type, basically saying, is this in an alert collection or is it not in an alert collection? And that drop-down list will just give you a list of the collections that match the record type, both on the rule and the alert collection. So if your alert collection does not show in this list, it's probably because you've either A, got the wrong record type on the rule, or B, you've got the wrong record type on the alert collection. And my actions is simply to add this to the alert collection. Pretty basic, not a huge amount to this rule at all. Now you might find, and I've got an example I'll get to in a moment, where you want a more refined list of records. And I do have an example with for example, low quantities of inventory that might be below certain reorder quantities or something of that nature. But at the moment, this is just so as I can show assets on a workflow desk. I could be saying maybe I'm only interested in assets of a certain asset type. Maybe I'm only interested in the cars because I'm part of the maintenance department, or maybe this alert collection relates to the IT related assets because I'm a part of the IT department. You can really refine that using the conditions tab there as well. So I've got a pretty, once again, keeping things relatively basic. I've got an asset management desktop. So I've dragged the alert collection option from the toolbox onto my desktop. Once you do that, you then have the option, of course, of selecting which alert collection it relates to. And of course, using that table layout, being able to design which fields I wish to show. So if I just go in and hit load desk, so I've got a list of assets here. And if I come into my asset management screen, and let's just cheat a little bit and just copy one and call it test and hit save. My rule has popped that into the alert collection. Now, if I wanted to, if this was a restrictive rule, so it was only showing certain records, then once again, I could have on the Actions tab had a notification, maybe display a pop-up message. So I could say asset, once again, hit that property button. Maybe I'll show the code and the description has been added to the all assets collection. So if I came in and hit copy again, just to show, yes, that is the rule that's firing that. It pops that into my alert collection. So yes, if there is some form of record you would like to show on a workflow desktop where that record isn't on the in the record type isn't in the toolbox, that is the way you can get around it. Now the other example I've set up for today, if I just bring up another example, is a low inventory workflow desktop. So in this example, I'm showing inventory items, or I will be showing inventory items that meet some kind of criteria. So same deal. When do I run it? It's on stock items. You'll notice this time that it's scheduled. So this might be something that you run every day in the morning. It could be something you run once a week. It could be used really to help someone in stock replenishment to know when they need to do purchase orders of certain items. If I hit the what to do section, the stock items have a couple additional options that we haven't seen in the previous steps. So in this example, you'll see things like quantity available and quantity on hand is either negative or it's within a certain reorder level. If I look here, I've got it that if it's less than or equal to 20% for a specific location, which I've got selected here. So this hasn't gone past its reorder value. So if I was to run a reorder report, I haven't hit my reorder point yet. It's just telling me, by the way, that I'm close to that reorder point. So if you are looking at doing some replenishment of stock, then you might know, well, this is close to reorder. If I'm already sending a purchase order to a supplier, I may as well include this item as well. And then what do? We're going to show that in the low inventory collection. And we're also, if it was already in that collection and it doesn't meet that condition, we want to remove it. So if someone has purchased some stock or returned some stock and suddenly it's no longer below that point, then of course automatically remove it from the list. So this kind of rule, as I said before, you would normally actually schedule, which under workflow, approvals and alerts, there's a task scheduler, which I can come in, select the process document rules. You can either do a once-off scenario or you can schedule it to either run weekly, daily, or using intervals, so every 5 minutes or something of that nature. Now I'm just going to hit run once just to kind of show the process. And you can either assign what we call rule groups, or I can just specify a specific rule. So I can select that inventory or low inventory rule there. I can hit add to task queue and away it goes. Alternatively, as I said, I can just come in and hit the run now button. And that's gone through and found out of all my inventory items, these ones are below 20% or within 20% of their minimum reorder quantities for location 2. So as I said before, you can really restrict or limit the records that show in those alert collections around whatever kind of criteria you would like. So that's alert collections in a bit of a nutshell. Now we'll jump into approvals, which is can be really looked at in 2 different ways, depending on the complexity of the rule itself, or the business rule, I should say, or the size of the organization can sometimes come into play. We find, smaller organizations can get away with simpler rules, whereas larger organizations tend to have a much more rigid process that they need to go through. So I've got a very basic purchase order rule set up. So I'm going to go through a basic example with purchase orders, and I'm going to go through a little bit more of a complex or couple of step process for supplier invoices, just to give you a bit of a feel of the two different scenarios. So to create an approval rule, of course, we need to have the rules, but we also need to have what we call approval codes. Now, you can reuse approval codes for as many rules as you'd like, as long as they are still relevant. So I've got an approval code in here called basic approval, which just says that Amanda needs to approve it, and then Cameron. So you can have as many different users or potentially groups within an approval code. And within that, you can either make it sequential, which means Amanda needs to approve it first, then Cameron. Alternatively, if you untick sequential, it'll go to both Amanda and Cameron at the same time. They both need to approve it, but they can do it in any order they'd like. If you have sequential, there's a couple of additional options that might be relevant. If you've got users that aren't in the office that often, or aren't available all the time, and you're concerned that that may hold up the process if they have to wait their turn, then you do have the option of saying approve in advance, which basically means that the rule still goes in the sequential order. But if I was to tick approve in advance, Cameron would see this record as soon as it assigned the approval code, rather than waiting till Amanda approved it. You can approve previous levels. So that really does require the approve in advance ticked as well. But that basically means if Cameron sees this before Amanda and approves it before Amanda, it'll approve it for Amanda as well, but it will stamp Cameron's name. So it still tracks who did the approval, but it means you're not waiting on a lower level approval to complete this process. You can also select override previous rejections. So in a scenario where you've got a number of levels in an approval rule, or approval code, I should say, if someone was to reject it anyway along the process, that's done, it's rejected, doesn't have to keep going, unless one of those override previous rejections is ticked, in which case it would then jump to that person to say, well, are you happy with this rejection, or do you want to keep looking into it? Okay, so that's our basic approval code. And if I look at my rule, once again, I've got my PO, my purchase order record type that I'm looking at. This is on new or on change. So of course, it's not just when you create a purchase order, but also when you might change it. You need to check these rules. And what do we want to do? So this list, you may notice, is a little bit longer, yet again, than the list that we had, say, on the supplier class, or even the inventory class, which had a few different options as well. You'll now start seeing that the net amount is between a certain range of values. And in this example, you see in brackets, it does say it's the local net amount. So, of course, Greentree does allow to have multiple currencies. So this rule would only really make sense going back to that local currency. So 500 Australian dollars in the example we're going through here, rather than obviously if the purchase order was in a different currency, which had a different exchange rate, we need to keep that in play as well. Now I've got here that as I said, the local amount is between $500 and an upper number. Now, if this rule only applies to certain people, then I can come in and say that the logged in user is either in or not in a certain team or group, or the logged in user is or is not a specific person. So if you've got a manager, which this rule does not apply to, then you can exclude them from this rule by selecting this option and say that the user is not maybe Amanda. Maybe this rule doesn't apply to Amanda. Maybe she has a larger delegated authority, or whatever else it might be. What do we then want to do? This preliminary process will show up on some, or be relevant for some record types. Usually things like purchase orders and invoices, or anything you really want to put on hold. This is the area you'd look at doing it. So in here, the list is relatively small. I've got to change the status. So you can select any status type you'd like. In this example, I've got pending approval selected there. So you can create as many status types that are relevant to the approval rules. So I put it on hold, and then I've got assigning the basic approval code, displaying a pop-up message telling the user your purchase order has been sent for approval, and I've got sending a notification message to all the approvers telling them that a purchase order requires their approval. If it's approved, take it off hold. If it's rejected, I've got it cancelling the purchase order. So once again, trying to keep things relatively simple for some of these examples before we dive in too far down the rabbit hole. So let's just bring up the purchase order entry screen and just try and get a bit of everything going on here. So let's come in, select our supplier, and we'll select one of these. And I'm going to change the price to be less than $500 for the moment, just to kind of show the point, and hit save. You'll notice it's still a status of entered. My approvals and alerts icon hasn't changed. Nothing's in my pending approvals for this record. But if I come in and say, that's $600 and hit save, I get a pop-up message saying your purchase order has been sent for approval. It's showing on the pending approvals screen. And on the notifications, Amanda was first in line. Sorry. I have to double check who was in line there. But if I just refresh this record, I can see it's marked as pending approval. And I look at my symbol here, I can see it's the basic approval code's been assigned. Hit show details. So one of the things you'll find is not only will you see obviously the approval code, who the approver is, what the status is. Over on the right hand side, if I make this screen a little bigger for everyone, I'll see what rule it was and what conditions were met to put us at this point. So the local net amount was $545. So obviously that's over our 500. Now I am logged in as a super user, which is an admin approval user. So if I hit approve now, it's going to warn me, but yes, I can approve it on behalf of everyone and hit OK. That removes it from being on hold. And if I look at my approval code, I can see it's marked as approved and hit show details, and it's marked the super user in both cases against who approved it. So regardless of delegated approvals, which is an option, admin approvers like the super user is, and the approve in advance, it will always stamp the username of who actually did the approval rather than who was meant to approve it. So it will stamp that and mark the date that was approved. So you may find that simple level of approval, so a pretty basic condition and using the approval codes may work perfectly fine for your organization. When you start looking at clients or some of our clients that have things like job cost as a module, we often find things like project managers and things of that nature end up coming into play, and you might want to have one set of rules. Now, if you've got a small list of project managers, you could have a different rule per project manager, but as that list gets a little larger, that becomes a little bit cumbersome. So I'll show you a couple of different examples as we go through. So if we jump on over to our accounts payable invoice option. So I've got a couple of rules set up here. These first four I'm showing are relevant. So you can have rules call other rules. We often call it an approval chain, and that's really where this more complex approval process may come into play. So I've got my example in my supplier invoices. The first rule I do, or I have, checks if the supplier invoice has lines that didn't come from a purchase order. Okay, and then it might have some sort of approval around that. I've then got a rule checking whether or not, if it did come from a purchase order, whether or not there are any variances. And then I've got an approval and a rejection rule, which I'll explain in just a moment as well. So when we start talking about complex rules, each rule in isolation is never really that complex. It's when you start chaining lots of rules together that it starts to get a little bit complex. So let's go look at that first rule. So when to run, I'm doing this on a supplier invoice. The one thing to keep in mind with approval rule chains is the first rule in the chain will be marked as form driven. The rest will have another option, which we'll be showing in just a moment. So what am I doing? The conditions, I've got an option in here that checks whether or not it did or did not come from a purchase order, which I've already got selected. And I've said where the local amount is over $500. So it's pretty much replicating that first approval rule I went through. But obviously, if I've already approved a purchase order for over $500, if it matches, there's no real need to then approve the invoice. So we can bring that into play in this scenario. Similar to what I did with the purchase order, I'm putting the invoice on hold. Under the actions, I'm assigning an approval code, the same one as before. So as I said, you can reuse them. If it's rejected, I'm calling another rule called rejected. If it's approved, instead of taking it off hold, I'm now calling my next rule in the chain. Now with approval chains, you'll also notice the quite a heavy use of this if conditions not met as well. So if the invoice didn't come from a purchase order and it's over $500, then we're putting it on hold and it requires approval. If it did come from a purchase order or it's less than $500, then I'm heading on over to check the whether or not it matched the purchase order. Okay. The next rule in the chain, as I said before, you'll notice this one isn't marked as form driven. So we've talked about the form driven a bit. We've talked about the scheduled. The next one we're really talking about is what we call programmatic. Now there's quite a few options in this list, and that list will differ depending on the record type. But the most common one you'll see is called by another rule. That'll be on all the different record types, and as I said, it'll be the most common programmatic event you'll use. What are we then going to do? So in this drop-down box, once again, supplier invoices have quite a big, quite a larger list of options. So I've gone in and I've said where the invoice has a total value which differs from the purchase order by either a monetary amount, in this example, $500, or a percentage, or it differs by 10%. So you can have a bit of a mix and match of the different options there. If it does differ, put it on hold, and then it requires an approval. Now this one, instead of using the basic approval code I had before, I've gone in and created one called detailed. And you'll notice in this example that no one is currently on the list, which might seem a little strange initially, but it will hopefully clear up pretty quickly. And I've got the can assign a specific person ticked. So what that allows me to do is in my rule, I can select that approval code, in this example, detailed approval, and I said requires approval by a specific person. So I've gone in and selected in this drop-down box in the specific person. You'll get a list of all the Greentree users. You'll get a list as well as a list of excuse me, additional options. And that list may vary a little bit depending on the record type, but you'll get a lot that'll be like created by user, or the created by users manager, or the created by user supervisor. Same with logged in, modified, and you'll notice down the bottom there's this purchase order created users. So in this scenario, I've got it that if it varied from the purchase order, it goes back to the person who did the purchase order to confirm that that's okay. Now you might define that as a different rule or a different process, and that's perfectly fine, but just as a fairly simple example, that's what I've got it doing. If it's approved, you'll notice that I'm checking that approved rule. If rejected, I'm calling that rejected rule. And if the conditions aren't met, it might sound a little strange at the moment, but I'm also checking the approved rule. The reason we do that when we start looking at chains of rules is because usually when you approve something, especially when you start talking about invoices or purchase orders, you probably want to send off an email to someone to say, hey, it's good to go. If it's rejected, you probably also want to do an email. And when you get to a larger chain, you don't want to then, if you want to change the wording of that email, have to change that in 4 or 5 or more places. So I've got 2 very simple rules. And that's what I was saying a little earlier. Each rule in this chain in themselves are very basic. It's when you start adding them together where the complexity starts to come into play. So the if approved simply checks, it's got one condition, has it been approved? It puts it on a hold code of none, i.e. takes it off hold. And I've got it sending a notification to the created by user saying your invoice blah has been approved. And the rejected one is very similar. It simply goes through, changes the hold code to rejected, and once again, messages the created by user and says, hey, your invoice has been rejected. So let's see this in play. So we'll come in, we'll select an invoice, try and get everything all on the one screen for you. So I'm going to start by just coming in and entering some information. So let's just go with an invoice with one line on it that's over $500, of course. Let's call it example 1, hit save. You'll notice that invoice is on waiting approval, and I've got that showing up on my pending approvals tile on my workflow desk. If I come in, it's the same approval rule I had before, so I'm going to approve it as the super user. All right. And you'll notice that's no longer showing there. It's been marked as approved. And if I was to just do example 2, and this time I'm going to include some purchase orders. If I select the purchase order and don't make any changes and hit save, looks like I have got that showing up. Let me just have a quick look at that rule. Perfect example of when you should be double checking some of your conditions. I'd like to say that I did that deliberately. We'll say that for the record. There's this concept of ands and ors. So in this example, the invoice, while yes, it did come from a purchase order, was well over $500. That should have been an and. If I just go in and hit save, because both of those conditions should have been met to fire off that rule. So we'll just do it again. Come in, select my purchase order, hit save. It hasn't been put on hold. No approval has been required. If I come in and change some of these numbers, so maybe this is come in at $700. Maybe this came in at 80 and hit save. You'll notice it's been put on hold. If I click on my icon here and hit show details, you'll notice it's detailed approval, not the basic one from before. The created by user of that purchase order was, funnily enough, Super. And once again, it tells us which rule caused this approval or required this approval. Come in, hit approve, and that can then take that off hold, and away we go. Okay, so approval chains are probably one of the most common approval processes when it comes to supplier invoices and purchase orders in some of our larger clients, and probably really the most complex part of approvals. The trick is to, as I said before, kind of really break them down into bite-sized chunks and not get too, I guess, bogged down in trying to make each individual rule overly complex. So that pretty much takes us through the notifications, alert collections, and being able to show records on workflow desktops, the simple and the complex. So let's pop up some of these questions.
Okay, Q&A time. So we're looking for any questions anyone may have.
Okay, so I guess some of the more common questions we get around approvals and alerts is what happens when there's a condition that isn't in my list. So most of today's session, I've gone through pre-existing conditions. So if I was to come back to, for example, that low inventory rule, the quantity available within 20% was a pre-existing condition. Now this list isn't infinite, so obviously if there is a more specific rule that you wish to, or a specific condition you wish to implement, there's two options you can use. One, you have access to do, and the other requires Star to potentially write a little bit of code. So you've got this green one, which is called record selection criteria, and the blue one, which is called custom script. So if you only wanted this rule to apply for high priority inventory items, for example, under this record selection criteria, I can select that and hit add. And then it's going to give me a list of every single database field against that record. So, which could include trees or user-defined fields, so or something of that nature. So you could come in here and I've got an is critical option. So I could drag and drop that across and say this only applies if the inventory item is a critical inventory item. So I can do that as well. In those rules that I went through before, especially around those supplier invoice example, where I said if it didn't come from a purchase order, it required approval. Now you may have certain supplier types that you want to exclude from that rule. So things like utility companies like power bill, phone bill, those sorts of things that may have either not require approval at all or may have just a different level. So once again, you can use that record selection criteria to take over there as well. So if I come into that, that example I had where it didn't come from a purchase order, under my conditions, I could have selected record selection criteria. I could have found, for example, the supplier. And once again, maybe there was some kind of supplier type tree or user-defined field, or maybe you've used something in their alpha code or name to trigger that. You can drag and drop that in there also.
What would happen if the approval party was on annual leave or maternity leave or uncontactable?
Yep. So one of the things you've got the ability of doing with approvals and alerts is this concept we call delegated authorities. So you don't have to go and change your rules. All you have to do is come to the user's preferences. So whoever that is that's going on leave, come into the workflow button, under approvals and BPM, where we talked about the manager and supervisor before, we also have the available users and the delegated users. So I could say, I'm on leave, Amanda can approve on my behalf. It will still stamp, it'll stamp Amanda's name, but it still assigns it to me. So there's still that full audit trail of who was meant to approve it and who actually approved it.
And who can get in and change those delegated authorities and such?
By default, users can set their own delegated authorities, but depending on how you would like to set that up, that's an option available as well.
So the debtor clerk can't get in and delegate the approval authority of her supervisor?
No. So users have the ability of setting their own delegated authorities. So if they were to go on leave, there is the ability that they can say who can approve on their behalf. However, no, a user would need access to the user maintenance screen, which would be fairly restricted in most of our sites. If we wanted to restrict, obviously, who could set someone else's delegated authority. One of the other things we find very commonly used in especially some of our larger sites that may have a little bit of a turnover issue is in your approvals, whether they be the approval rules or whether they be those approval codes, rather than assigning something to a user, assigning something to a role or team. So if you do have a situation where maybe a rule, one of the steps in the rule is it assigns it to the finance manager, then rather than, and let's for argument's sake, assume Amanda here is our finance manager, rather than assign it to Amanda, we could create under workflow approvals alerts, we have this approval group concept. So I can create one called finance manager, assign Amanda. Then in that approval code I had before, rather than assigning Amanda, I could have assigned the finance manager group. And let's get rid of Amanda there. So now the same thing is going to happen. It's going to assign it to Amanda effectively. But if Amanda was to leave or her role was changed and someone else was now looking after that role, I can simply come into that approval group and say, well, it's no longer Amanda as the finance manager, it's now Angela. I don't have to change any of my rules whatsoever because they were all looking at approval groups rather than users. So another question, how do we set up an automated email to our account customers if they go past their 30 days end of month payment terms, say send it 45 days? It's a very good question. So if I come into my rule maintenance screen, so we have two, I guess, main options around this. So we can either send it based on the individual invoice, which is one option and probably the easiest option available to you, or alternatively you can do it based on the customers. So I'm going to show it based on the invoice because it's probably the easier one to demonstrate. But potentially, if you were looking at doing it based on the customer itself, then we could potentially get in contact with your consultant, and they'll be able to assist you with setting up that rule. I guess the reason why I'm differentiating those two is if you do have a customer that maybe has lots of invoices, and maybe 4 or 5 of those invoices hits that 45 days, then you might have a situation where you go, okay, I want one email listing all 4 or 5 invoices, or do you want an email per invoice? So we'll come on in, and that was a customer example. So that is the accounts receivable invoice record type. So this would be a scheduled rule. Now this rule we would probably schedule to run every day, which may sound a little strange to begin with, but it's probably how we'd have that set up. And we'll give it a name. So we're going to call it, what have we got? Say send it 45 days. So in that example, there'd be 15 days after the payment date. So we're going to schedule that to run. the conditions. You can obviously scroll through and have a look at all those options, but I know because obviously I've done this a few times. I'm going to go straight to record selection criteria and hit add. So the AR invoice has a payment date. So the specific question was around customers with a 30 days end of month payment terms, and we want to send the email at effectively 45 days, giving them a 15-day buffer. So here I'm saying the payment date is equal to, so on the 45 days, which effectively, as I said, is 15 days after the payment date, I can say is today. So there's not too many keywords to be concerned about. Once again, training in this module would be suggested, but effectively, when we're looking at dates, we can use the word today and a plus or minus. So we're interested where the payment date is today less 15. So 15 days ago, the payment date was due, and we can bring that in. Now, if you wanted to be very specific, you can then, of course, come in and say where the customer's default payment terms were 30 days from end of month or something like that. So scroll on down and select the default payment terms and is equal to whatever your payment term code is. I'll leave that off for the moment to keep things simple. Hit OK. The actions, as I said, you just want to send an email. Now you may or may not, depending on your I guess your business model or business structure or accountability, you might decide that instead of sending the email to the customer, you want to send it to the salesperson. Either or, we'll send it an email for the moment. Send an email, hit add. You've got the option of coming into the properties, selecting the customer's email address. So drag and drop that and say, invoice, and let's find the invoice number is now overdue. Please pay invoice, the invoice number, which was due on a certain payment date, and so on and so on. You can add as many fields here, of course, as you'd like. And hit OK. Now, for the moment, I'm going to take that off and put my own email address, because otherwise that's not going to go anywhere. And as I said before, you would now schedule that to run under Workflow, Approvals Alerts, Task Scheduler. I'd simply come in and say, let's schedule this daily at, let's say, 10 a.m. And big long list of the ones that we can schedule, but there's our AR invoice 15 days. Sorry. And hit add to task here. And away you go. As I said before, you can add more criteria within that as well. If you decide you want to send effectively an email every 15 days after that, or whatever it might be, you would basically be creating a rule that would be per email. So the first email, the second email, the third email. If you want to have them, I guess, escalate in verbiage, you want it to sound, I guess, nastier the longer they haven't paid their bill. And of course, you can have a different email per rule there.
Okay, last question from Serena. How would I create a desktop tile to show invoices due for payment for a selection of supplier codes only?
Yeah, sure. So within that, you would, first of all, that was a supplier invoices. Yep. So I would come into my alert collection. I would select the supplier invoice class. Let's just call this one overdue invoices for the moment. So once again, come into my rules, select the same class. This would be a scheduled rule again, so you'd probably schedule this to run, or you could run as frequently as you'd like, I guess. You could run this in the morning, you could run it multiple times during the day. Come in with your conditions. So this would be a couple of things. So for starters, one of the questions was show the invoices with that are due for payment for a selection of supplier codes. So the supplier codes first will come in, record selection criteria, find our supplier. Now I could either just come in and say code, just keep hitting code and use the ORs. So it's equal to, 2000, 2003, whatever the numbers might be. What I think would be more appropriate is to instead scroll down or create a tree or a user-defined tick box to say it applies to this rule. So maybe instead I want the supplier type is other, or whatever else it might be relevant. So you can either list the supplier codes or use a tree or user-defined field. And then the next question, of course, was around being overdue or due for payment in some way. So I can come in here and depending on how you set up your first record selection criteria, you might need to create a new one. So let's come in, hit add, and this is where you could start looking at the outstanding amount is greater than 0. And similar to the rule that we did around the customer invoice notification, I could have come in here with the payment date and said is maybe before today, plus 10 or whatever it might be. So it's due within the next 10 days or something of that nature. Hopefully that answers that question of how you can get them onto a desktop tile. And as I said before, you can then just drag that alert collection onto the workflow desktops.
Okay, we've run out of time, so we won't be able to answer any more questions today, unfortunately. But thank you for attending today's webinar. Please feel free to ring the STAR office and speak with your regular STAR consultant if you have any questions. Or if you have anything specific, you can try ring Josh, who is one of our busiest people. So even I have trouble getting him sometimes. So maybe your consultant's the best option as a first port of call. If you have any more questions, you're also welcome to email them to me, and I'll pass them on to the appropriate person. So once again, thank you. The video for this should be available within the next 24 hours.
Thanks all.